Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The ice-crusted ferry lurched against the dock at Rock Harbor, and Ethan Harper felt the familiar satisfaction of returning to Isle Royale in winter. Most people considered the park closed this time of year, abandoned to the wolves and the cold. But that's when the real work happened, February 2014, and he'd spent the last 6 winters conducting wildlife surveys in the park's frozen interior, tracking moose populations, wolf pack movements, and the delicate ecological balance that made this isolated wilderness a living laboratory. He was a scientist. That's what he told himself every morning. What he'd built his entire identity around. Rational, methodical. Everything had an explanation if you looked hard enough, gathered enough data, applied the right analytical framework. The universe operated on observable principles, and his job was simply to document them. Charlotte Webb had been his colleague for 3 years, and she shared his devotion to empirical truth. They'd spent countless hours in the park's research station, debating population models and laughing at the tourists who claimed to see mysterious lights in the forest or hear impossible sounds in the night. Pareidolia, they'd concluded. Pattern-seeking brains finding meaning in random data. The human mind's desperate need to impose narrative on chaos. She'd radioed in 4 days ago from her camp near Siskiwit Bay, her voice crackling through the static with characteristic precision. Moose kill site, she'd reported. Wolfpack behavior anomalous. Extending observation period. Standard protocol. They'd done it dozens of times. But her daily check-ins had stopped. 24 hours was protocol violation. 48 was concerning. 72 was emergency. At 96 hours, Ethan had loaded his gear and convinced the park's winter caretaker to authorize the ferry crossing from the mainland. Now he stood on the dock, watching his breath crystallize in the -15-degree air, and told himself this was routine. Equipment failure, dead radio batteries. Charlotte was meticulous, but technology failed in extreme cold. Simple explanation, always a simple explanation. The snowmobile journey to Siskiwit Bay took 3 hours through landscape that seemed scraped clean of color. White snow, black trees, gray sky pressing down like a lid on a frozen world. The GPS guided him along the island's southern shore, past Malone Bay and along the ridge that overlooked frozen Superior. His headlamp cut a thin tunnel through the gathering dusk. He found Charlotte's camp exactly where her coordinates indicated, and his first thought was relief. The tent was intact, properly staked and banked with snow for insulation. Her snowmobile sat covered beside it, gear properly stored and secured. Everything looked correct from 50 feet away. Then he got closer, and everything stopped being correct. The tent fabric was shredded, not torn by wind or damaged by animals, shredded from the inside. Long gouges that started at waist height and raked upward, as if something had clawed its way out with desperate strength. The sleeping bag had been pulled through one of the tiers and lay crumpled in the snow, dark stains frozen into the fabric. Ethan's analytical mind immediately began cataloging observations. Stains consistent with blood. Volume significant, but not necessarily fatal. Pattern suggests struggle, but no signs of predation. Bears were hibernating. Wolves didn't attack humans. His radio came off his belt smoothly, muscle memory from 100 safety drills. Rock Harbor, this is Harper. I've reached Webb's campsite. Possible emergency situation. Evidence of violence, no sign of Charlotte. Requesting immediate support. The radio hissed nothing but static. He adjusted the frequency, checked the battery, transmitted again. More static. Equipment failure, his mind supplied. Atmospheric conditions. Solar activity. There were explanations. He approached the tent slowly, calling Charlotte's name, some part of him still expecting her to emerge with a rational story about a moose blundering through camp or equipment malfunction. But the interior was chaos. Her research equipment lay smashed, laptop crushed as if stomped on, GPS unit scattered in pieces, satellite phone broken into components. Her clothing was torn and scattered. Blood spatter marked the tent walls in arterial patterns that made his stomach clench, but it was the notebook that made him stop breathing. Charlotte's field journal lay open in the center of the destruction, and she'd written something on the last page. Her handwriting, normally precise and controlled, deteriorated into increasingly frantic scrawl. "It's not wolves." The kill site. Something's wrong with the consumption pattern. Bone marrow extracted but meat left to freeze. Tracks circle the site but never approach directly. Repetitive pattern like pacing, like thinking. Found something at the kill site. Carved symbols in the trees. Not random, deliberate. Ojibwe maybe? Warnings? Heard it last night. Not howling, screaming. Human screaming, but wrong pitch, wrong rhythm, like a recording played backwards. Came from North Ridge. Nothing should be up there in winter. It knows I'm here. The tracks came to my camp last night. Circled 3 times and left. Bipedal. Stride length impossible. 9 feet, 10 feet. Went through the deep snow like it weighed nothing. I measured. I photographed. This doesn't fit any known species. I can hear it breathing outside the tent. The final entry was just 2 words, written so hard the pen had torn through the paper. So hungry Ethan's hands were shaking, and he told himself it was the cold. He photographed every page with methodical precision, documenting everything like the scientist he was. Evidence, data. There would be explanations. He found Charlotte's camera in the wreckage, the SD card miraculously intact. His laptop was in his pack, and he booted it up despite the cold, fingers clumsy with thermal gloves. The images loaded slowly. The first photos were standard documentation. Moose carcass, partially consumed, wolf tracks in the surrounding snow. Normal. Expected. Then the images changed. Other tracks. Charlotte's zoom lens had captured them in brutal detail. Bipedal impressions in the snow, each footprint massive and elongated, toes tipped with what looked like claws. The stride length was exactly as she'd documented, 10 feet or more between impressions. And there were details that made his scientist's brain rebel. The prints showed no slip, no variation in depth despite the uneven terrain. Whatever made them had moved with impossible balance and control. More photos showed the trees surrounding the kill site, symbols carved into the bark, angular and deliberate. Ethan recognized them from anthropology courses, Ojibwe pictographs. But these weren't historical artifacts. The exposed wood was fresh, the cuts recent. Someone or something had carved them within the last few days. He enlarged the images, trying to interpret the symbols. A figure with a skeletal body and antlered head. Crossed lines that might represent a prohibition or warning. A spiral that seemed to suggest transformation or change. And in the background of one photo, barely visible in the tree line, was a shape. Ethan's breath caught. He enlarged the image further, fighting the pixelation. Tall, impossibly tall. The figure stood at least 8 or 9 feet, angular and thin to the point of emaciation. The head was wrong, elongated, with what might have been antlers or branches protruding at odd angles. The image was blurred, as if the figure had been moving, but 2 points were perfectly clear. Eyes that caught the camera flash with an animal's reflective gleam, and a mouth open in what might have been a grin or a snarl, showing too many teeth. Pareidolia, Ethan whispered to the empty tent. Pattern recognition, branch formation, trick of light and shadow. But he didn't believe it. For the first time in his rational scientific life, he looked at empirical evidence and felt his certainty crumble. The scream that split the twilight wasn't animal. It started low, almost human, then climbed in pitch and volume until it became something that shouldn't exist. A sound that seemed designed to trigger every primitive fear hardwired into human neurology. It came from the north, from the ridge Charlotte had mentioned, and it went on for impossibly long, as if whatever produced it had lungs that didn't need oxygen. Then it stopped, and the silence afterward was worse. Ethan grabbed his pack and ran for his snowmobile. His hands fumbled with the ignition, and the engine turned over with a roar that seemed obscenely loud in the frozen quiet. He accelerated down the trail, not caring about protocol or safety. just needing to move to create distance. But there was something ahead on the trail. His headlamp found it 30 yards away, a figure standing motionless in the center of the path. Impossibly tall, skeletal thin, the light gleamed off exposed bone or perhaps skin stretched so tight it might as well have been bone. Antlers. No, bones protruding from the skull at unnatural angles, and those eyes reflecting the headlamp beam with a predator's gleam. Ethan jerked the handlebars, sending the snowmobile careening off the trail into deeper snow. The engine whined, tracks fighting for purchase. Behind him, he heard movement. Footfalls in snow, but too fast, covering ground that should have been impossible. The snowmobile's engine died. He yanked the ignition cord again and again. Nothing. The rational part of his mind cataloged possibilities. Fuel line frozen, spark plug failed, kill switch triggered. But the primitive part, the part that knew when it was being hunted, was screaming at him to run. Footsteps in the snow. Closer. Each one deliberate, paced as if the thing following him had all the time in the world. Ethan abandoned the snowmobile and ran. His snowshoes sank deep with each step, progress agonizingly slow. His breath came in ragged gasps that turned to ice crystals before reaching the ground. Behind him, the footsteps matched his pace effortlessly, never quite catching up, but never falling behind. Playing with him, hurting him. He didn't know he was screaming until his throat went raw. The forest opened into a clearing, and Ethan stumbled to a halt. More symbols carved into every tree, forming a ring around the open space. And in the center, partially buried in blown snow, was what remained of the moose kill. Except it wasn't just the moose anymore. Charlotte's jacket, her boots, her field vest with the Park Service patch, arranged around the carcass like offerings. And the bones, human bones, he knew them instantly despite every instinct that wanted to deny it, scattered among the moose remains, gnawed and splintered for marrow. The thing stepped into the clearing behind him. Ethan turned slowly, his scientist's mind still trying to catalog what he saw even as the rest of him dissolved into pure terror. 9 feet tall, perhaps more. Skin the color of frozen corpses, pulled tight over bones that seemed elongated and wrong. The head was skull-like, sunken eyes that burned with an intelligence that was worse than animal hunger because it was aware, thinking, choosing. Antlers or bone protrusions twisted from the skull in asymmetrical patterns. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth that were human-shaped but too long, too sharp, filed or grown into predatory tools. And it was starving. That was somehow visible in every line of its impossible body. The desperate, eternal hunger that could never be satisfied no matter how much it consumed. It spoke. The sound that came from its throat was Charlotte's voice, but broken and reformed into something alien. Words in a language Ethan didn't know, guttural and ancient, but the meaning crashed into his mind anyway. So hungry, always hungry, feed. The hunger become the hunger, join the hunger. Charlotte, Ethan heard himself whisper, and some part of the thing's face shifted in what might have been recognition or mockery. His radio crackled to life. Through the static came a voice, his own voice, but distorted. Rock Harbor, this is Harper. Everything's fine. Webb and I are extending our research period. We'll radio again in 1 week. The thing hadn't moved its mouth, it was simply broadcasting using his voice, ensuring no one would come looking. Ethan's legs gave out. He sat down hard in the snow, staring up at the creature, at Charlotte or what Charlotte had become, and felt his rational worldview shatter completely. This wasn't a known predator. This wasn't explainable. The symbols on the trees were warnings left by people who'd encountered this before, who'd tried to contain it, and they'd failed because you couldn't contain hunger that never ended. The Wendigo, his anthropology courses came back to him with awful clarity. The Algonquian curse of famine and cannibalism, the transformation that happened when hunger drove humans to consume human flesh, the eternal craving that could never be satisfied, only grow stronger with each victim. Not mythology, not legend. Real. I'm sorry, he said, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to Charlotte or himself or the universe that had just proven itself larger and darker than his science could measure. The thing took a step closer, and Ethan saw his death in its movements. slow, inevitable, patient. It would feed, and the feeding would transform him or simply end him. And either way, the hunger would continue. Maybe forever. Maybe until the world itself froze over. But somewhere in the back of his analytical mind, a thought formed. The symbols on the trees. Warnings, yes, but also bindings. Spiritual containment. The Ojibwe hadn't just fled from this thing. They'd fought it with their own understanding of reality, a framework that didn't rely on scientific materialism. His pack was at his feet. Inside was his emergency flare gun, loaded with a phosphorus charge hot enough to melt steel. Fire, sacred in almost every tradition, the purifying element. The Wendigo lunged. Ethan pulled the flare gun and fired point blank into the creature's chest. The phosphorus round ignited with a white-hot fury that turned night into noon. The Wendigo's scream was all frequencies at once, Charlotte's voice and animal howls and the sound of ice cracking under pressure. It staggered backward, flames spreading across its emaciated body with impossible speed, as if its very flesh was fuel waiting to ignite. Ethan scrambled backward, shielding his eyes from the glare. The creature thrashed and burned, but it wasn't dying. It was transforming. The flesh peeled away to reveal something underneath, something that might have been pure hunger given form. And for a moment, Ethan saw into the heart of it, an endless void that consumed and could never be filled. Then the flames found something vital, and the Wendigo collapsed. The fire burned hotter, fueled by things Ethan's science couldn't name, until there was nothing left but ash and the acrid smell of burning meat. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a nightmare ends, when you're not quite sure if you're awake. Ethan sat in the snow watching the embers and felt something fundamental break inside him. His rational worldview hadn't just been challenged, it had been obliterated. The universe was wider and stranger and more terrifying than he'd ever imagined. There were things that existed outside the frameworks of science, patterns that couldn't be measured or quantified. Charlotte was gone, not missing, not dead in a way he could explain to her family or document in a report, transformed and then destroyed, her suffering unimaginable. He made it back to his snowmobile on legs that barely worked. The engine started on the first try now, as if whatever had been interfering was gone. The radio worked. Rock Harbor responded immediately to his emergency call, concerned about the long silence. He told them Charlotte was dead. Animal attack. He'd found remains. He needed immediate extraction. He didn't tell them the truth. Who would believe it? His own mind kept trying to recontextualize what he'd seen. Hypothermia-induced hallucination, psychological break, exposure trauma. But his camera held images of the symbols. His radio had recordings of sounds that shouldn't exist. Charlotte's notebook documented her transformation from scientist to victim to something else entirely. The ferry ride back to the mainland took 3 hours. Ethan spent it staring at the frozen lake, remembering the look in those burning eyes. Recognition. Intelligence. Hunger that could never end because it had become the thing's entire existence, its purpose and identity and curse, all at once. He thought about the Ojibwe warnings carved into trees. How many times had this happened before? How many people had encountered the Wendigo and either died or, worse, became it? A cycle of hunger feeding on itself, generation after generation, in the frozen places where desperation and starvation blurred the line between human and monster. The mainland was civilization, warmth, rationality. But Ethan knew he'd left part of himself on Isle Royale, in that clearing surrounded by warning symbols. The part that believed the universe was comprehensible and safe and bound by rules he could understand. He resigned from the Park Service 3 weeks later, couldn't explain why to his colleagues, who wanted to help him process the tragedy of losing Charlotte. He moved to Phoenix, as far from winter and forests as he could get, found work teaching high school biology, where the universe was small and manageable and confined to textbook certainty. But on February nights when the temperature dropped and the wind howled with a particular pitch, Ethan would wake from dreams of being hunted. And he'd lie there in the dark, listening to his own breathing, and wonder if the hunger was something that could be transferred. If maybe in that moment of looking into the Wendigo's eyes something had recognized him back. The rational part of his mind said it was trauma, PTSD, the normal psychological aftermath of witnessing horror, but the part that had been fundamentally changed on Isle Royale, the part that now knew the universe contained spaces where science's light didn't reach, that part wondered if maybe he'd survived, not because he'd destroyed the creature, but because it had chosen to let him go. Chosen to let him carry the hunger back to civilization, to spread the knowledge that in the frozen places, where desperation breeds and humans are pushed to their limits, transformation waits. Not metaphorical transformation. Real change, flesh and bone and soul, remaking you into something that can never be satisfied. Ethan got thinner that first year. He told himself it was stress, told himself the constant gnawing sensation in his stomach was anxiety, told himself the way he stared at people on the street, measuring them, calculating, was just hypervigilance from trauma. He told himself a lot of things, but late at night when he was alone, he'd pull up the photos from Charlotte's camera on his laptop, zoom in on that blurred figure in the trees, stare at those eyes that caught the flash, and he'd whisper to the empty room, "So hungry." And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd swear he heard something whisper back, "Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?" The snowmobile's engine died with a mechanical cough that echoed through the frozen wilderness like a death rattle. Jessica Reeves sat in the sudden silence, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the 20 below air, and stared at the coordinates glowing on her GPS unit. This was it. The last known location of Brandon Chen's emergency beacon before it went dark 3 days ago. She'd known Brandon for 6 years. They'd worked together at the National Park Service's Search and Recovery Division, pulling lost hikers out of slot canyons in Utah, tracking confused elderly wanderers through the Smokies, coordinating rescue operations across a dozen states. Brandon was methodical, experienced, careful to the point of paranoia. He carried 3 forms of communication, checked in every 4 hours without fail, and treated wilderness protocol like gospel. The fact that he'd simply vanished, that his beacon had transmitted for exactly 47 minutes before going silent, that his last radio call had been nothing but static and what might have been breathing, violated everything Jessica understood about her partner. That's what she told herself as she killed the snowmobile's lights and stepped into the blue-white twilight of the Minnesota wilderness. That this was simply another recovery operation. That her analytical mind would find the logical explanation everyone else had missed. That the churning unease in her stomach was just concern for a colleague, nothing more. The Forest Service had already sent 2 search teams. Both had returned empty-handed, their reports frustratingly vague. Unusual conditions, the first team leader had written. Tracking difficulties due to weather anomalies. The second team had been even less helpful. Recommend postponing search until spring thaw. Jessica had read between the lines, seen what they hadn't written. Something had spooked them. Professionals who spent their lives in the backcountry didn't abandon searches because of snow. She'd come alone, against protocol, against common sense, against the explicit orders of her supervisor. But Brandon was her partner, and the bureaucratic delays and unexplained reluctance of the other teams had made her decision simple. She'd filed a route plan, packed for 5 days and driven 14 hours north through a worsening storm to reach the boundary waters in late February, when any sane person had long since fled south. The forest around her was absolutely still. No wind, no bird calls, no distant crack of ice or whisper of settling snow. Just silence so complete it pressed against her eardrums like physical weight. Jessica had spent enough time in winter wilderness to know this wasn't normal. There should be sound, ravens at least, or the groan of trees contracting in the cold. Instead, nothing. The kind of nothing that made prey animals freeze and watch the shadows. She pushed the thought away and focused on the evidence. Brandon's last coordinates placed him approximately 200 yards northeast, near the shore of a small unnamed lake the locals called Windigu Zagaigan. The Forest Service maps used a different name, Carter Lake, but Jessica had learned enough Ojibwe during her years working Minnesota to recognize the translation, Wendigo Lake. She'd assumed it was just another piece of colorful regional folklore, the kind of name that accumulated around remote places. Every wilderness had its ghost stories. The snow was deep, over 3 feet in places, and her snowshoes sank with each step. The sky above was that peculiar shade of gray that meant more snow coming, the air so cold her nose hairs froze with each breath. She'd dressed in layers, thermal base, fleece mid-layer, insulated parka, but the cold still found ways through, creeping along her spine like searching fingers. She found the first marker 30 yards from where she'd left the snowmobile, a strip of orange flagging tape tied to a birch branch, exactly the kind Brandon would have used to mark his trail. Jessica felt a flutter of relief, evidence of methodical thinking, of her partner following protocol. She photographed it with her camera, noted the GPS coordinates, and continued northeast. The forest grew denser. White pine and black spruce crowded close, their branches heavy with snow, creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect. Jessica's headlamp beam seemed to die just feet ahead of her, swallowed by the oppressive darkness between the trees. She found 3 more markers, each one drawing her deeper into the forest, and tried not to think about fairy tales, about breadcrumbs and trails that led to gingerbread houses, about how in those stories the markers were never meant to lead anyone home. The 4th marker was wrong. Jessica stood in front of the birch tree, her analytical mind cataloging the wrongness even as her hindbrain screamed at her to turn around. The orange tape was there, tied at the correct height, but the knot was backwards. Brandon was left-handed. He tied knots in a distinctive way, always had. This knot was right-handed, and there was something else. Dark stains on the tape, brown against the orange. Old blood, she thought, then immediately questioned the assessment. Could be tree sap, could be dirt, could be anything. She touched the tape with her gloved hand, and it crumbled. The fabric was degraded, friable, as if it had hung here for years rather than days. That wasn't possible. Brandon had been out here for less than a week. Ultraviolet degradation took months, minimum. Yet the evidence was undeniable. This tape had been exposed to the elements far longer than it should have been. Jessica's radio crackled. She jumped, her heart hammering, and fumbled for it. "Jessica, if you hear this, don't." Brandon's voice, barely audible through waves of static. Then nothing. Brandon, I'm here. What's your position?" She waited, listening to white noise. "Brandon, please respond." The radio stayed silent. Jessica checked the frequency, the battery, the antenna. Everything functioned perfectly. She'd heard his voice, she was certain of that, but it made no sense. Brandon's radio had been dead for 3 days. The batteries would have died, unless he'd found shelter, conserved power. But then why not use the emergency beacon? Why not maintain regular contact? Because he can't, a voice whispered in her mind. Because something won't let him. She shoved the thought away and continued following the markers. The terrain began to slope downward, and through the trees ahead she caught glimpses of white, the frozen surface of the lake. Almost there, she'd find Brandon's camp, find some logical explanation for all of this, and they'd both laugh about it over beers once they got back to civilization. The camp was exactly where the coordinates indicated, set back from the lakeshore in a small clearing. Jessica's relief lasted approximately 3 seconds, the time it took her eyes to register what she was seeing. Brandon's tent was shredded, not collapsed from snow weight, not damaged by wind, but torn open. The technical fabric ripped into ribbons that hung from the poles like rotted flags. His gear was scattered across the clearing, sleeping bag pulled apart with methodical violence, food containers crushed and empty, equipment smashed and half buried in the snow. It looked like a bear attack, except it was February in Minnesota, and every bear for 500 miles was deep in hibernation. Jessica moved through the debris, her headlamp picking out details. Brandon's satellite phone, screen shattered, his GPS unit, crushed as if by massive force, his backup radio, torn from its case. Every piece of communication equipment destroyed, but his medical kit was untouched, his spare clothes still neatly packed, his journal lying open in the snow, pages covered in cramped handwriting. She picked up the journal with trembling hands. The early entries were typical Brandon: weather observations, coordinates, notes about wildlife sign. Then, 3 days ago, the handwriting changed, became rushed, frantic. Something watching from the trees, tracks around camp, wrong shape, too large. Heard breathing last night, not wind. Tried to leave, but the markers lead in circles. GPS coordinates changing. This isn't possible. The next entry was worse. Saw it. Stood at the edge of the clearing, 8 feet tall. Antlers, or bones. Couldn't tell. Eyes like empty sockets, but it saw me. When it moved, the trees bent away, nature itself recoiling. I understand now why they call this place Wendigo Lake. The stories aren't stories. The final entry was a single line, written in what looked like dried blood. "It's wearing my face." Jessica's hands were shaking badly enough that she nearly dropped the journal. This wasn't Brandon. Brandon didn't believe in supernatural things. He was rational, scientific, the one who taught her to look for evidence over emotion. This journal read like the ravings of someone experiencing a psychotic break. And yet the camp was destroyed. And yet he was missing. And yet her radio had picked up his voice even though his equipment was smashed beyond repair. She became aware, gradually, that the silence had deepened. Not just quiet, but absolute. A void that seemed to absorb sound, rather than simply mark its absence. Her own breathing seemed muffled, distant. The beam of her headlamp had taken on a strange quality, the light not illuminating so much as revealing what was already there in the darkness. Liam Cooper had explained away 23 disappearances in his 14 years with the National Park Service. Each case had a rational explanation: hypothermia, wildlife attacks, falls into ravines, simple human error compounded by panic. He'd published papers on the subject, appeared on a Discovery Channel documentary about missing persons in national parks, and earned a reputation as the man who could demystify any wilderness tragedy. The Olympic National Forest, with its labyrinthine trails and unpredictable weather, provided plenty of opportunities for him to practice his craft. So when the call came about Harper Williams, missing 4 days in the Hoh River corridor, Liam approached it with his usual methodical confidence. 24 years old, experienced hiker, last seen heading toward the Glacier Meadows Trail. Standard search pattern, standard outcome expected. By the 3rd day of searching, he'd already drafted the likely conclusion in his mind. Exposure, probably a fall. Body would be found within a week when the weather cleared. What he didn't expect was finding her camera. The ranger who discovered it, a younger man named Torres, had looked genuinely disturbed when he radioed it in. Liam hiked 2 miles off the established trail to reach the location, annoyed at the deviation from search protocol. The camera sat on a moss-covered stump in a small clearing, placed deliberately, lens facing the trail. Not dropped, not discarded, positioned. "Nobody touched it?" Liam asked, pulling on latex gloves. "No, sir. It's exactly how I found it." Torres kept glancing at the tree line, his usual chatter absent. Liam turned the camera over in his hands. A Canon power shot, several years old, the kind serious hikers carried in 2007. The memory card slot was closed, the battery apparently still functional. The power light blinked when he pressed the button. But it was the smell that caught his attention first. Not the expected odor of plastic and electronics exposed to moisture, but something organic, sweet and putrid at once, like rotting vegetation mixed with copper. "Did you check the photos?" he asked. Torres shook his head quickly. Too quickly. "Thought you should do that. Chain of evidence and all." Liam studied the younger ranger. "You looked, didn't you?" "Just the last one," Torres admitted, his voice tight. "On the preview screen. I didn't mean to. It just came up when I checked if it was working." "And?" Torres met his eyes briefly, then looked away. "You should see for yourself, sir." Back at the ranger station, Liam downloaded the photos to his laptop while Torres made coffee neither of them would drink. The first images were standard hiking shots, trail markers, panoramic views of the Hoh rainforest, Selfies of Harper Williams smiling in front of ancient Sitka spruces. She had her mother's eyes, Liam knew from the missing person report. Her mother, who was calling the station twice a day, voice breaking with each hour of continued silence. The timestamps showed a normal progression through the first day of her hike. But on the second day, something changed. The photos became random, unfocused. Tree trunks captured at odd angles, the forest floor, the sky through branches, as if Harper had been taking pictures while walking, not even looking at what she was photographing, or as if something else had been triggering the shutter. Then came the symbols, carved into bark, arranged in stones drawn in the dirt, strange geometric patterns that seemed to repeat with variations. Liam zoomed in on one image. The symbol looked like a cross between Cyrillic letters and Native American pictographs, spirals intersecting with sharp angular lines. He'd seen plenty of trail graffiti in his years, but nothing like this. These marks looked old, weathered, as if they'd been there for decades. Yet none of the search teams had reported seeing them. "What do you think those are?" Torres asked from over his shoulder. "Hoax, probably. Someone heard about the missing hiker, planted these to create a mystery." But even as Liam said it, he didn't quite believe it. The symbols appeared too organically integrated into the forest, bark healing around the edges of the carvings, moss growing in the grooves. The next photo made him pause. It was taken at twilight. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m. on Harper's third day out. The image showed the trail ahead, forest darkening on either side. But the trees in the photograph looked wrong. The massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks that dominated this part of the forest appeared to lean inward, their branches reaching across the trail like grasping fingers. It had to be a trick of the lighting, shadows creating an illusion of movement. Liam had seen enough forced perspective photos to recognize one, except the trees in the next photo, taken 1 minute later from almost the same position, were different. The branches had moved. The trunks had shifted. The trail itself seemed narrower, more enclosed. Liam clicked through faster now. Photo after photo showed the forest closing in, the trail disappearing. Darkness swallowing everything except for those symbols, which now seemed to glow faintly in the images, as if illuminated from within. Then came the audio file. Harper's camera could record short video clips. The last file on the memory card was dated 11:34 p.m. Her third night. Liam hesitated before clicking play, his hand hovering over the mouse. Torres had gone completely silent behind him. The video showed only darkness at first, the camera's night mode struggling to process what little light existed. Then Harper's face appeared, illuminated by a small flashlight held under her chin. She looked exhausted, her eyes wide and glassy. When she spoke, her voice cracked with thirst and something else, a tremor that Liam had heard before in people who'd been lost too long, when the mind started to fracture. "I don't know if anyone will find this," Harper whispered. "I've been walking for hours, but I keep ending up back here, back at this same tree with this same mark." She turned the camera, showing one of the symbols carved deep into ancient bark. "I thought I was going in circles at first, but my compass says I'm heading north every time. North toward the ranger station, but I always end up here." She turned the camera back to her face. "There's something out here. I know how that sounds, I know. But there's something walking parallel to me. I can hear it in the brush. It's big, bigger than a bear. And sometimes..." She paused, listening. "Sometimes I hear it talking. Not in English, not in any language, but I understand it anyway. It says this is its place. It says I violated something, took something that wasn't mine." Harper's flashlight flickered. She tapped it against her palm, and when the light steadied, Liam saw something in the background of the video. Behind Harper, perhaps 50 feet back, two pale shapes hovered in the darkness. They looked like eyes. Enormous eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like an animal's, but positioned impossibly high off the ground. "It says the forest remembers," Harper continued, apparently unaware of what the camera had captured behind her. "Every tree that was cut without permission, Every plant taken without offering, every animal killed without respect. It remembers, and it demands. The video cut off. Not gradually, not with a sense of the camera being turned off. It simply ended mid-word, as if someone had physically severed the recording. Liam replayed the last 3 seconds 5 times, freezing on the frame that showed those eyes most clearly. They weren't eyes at all, he realized. They were knots in the wood of 2 trees, positioned at roughly 7 feet high, catching the light in a way that created the illusion of reflection. Had to be. "We need to expand the search to this area," he said, his voice steady despite the crawling sensation on the back of his neck. She was disoriented, possibly hypothermic. The hallucinations are consistent with advanced exposure. "Sir," Torres said quietly, "those symbols. I've seen them before." Liam turned in his chair. "Where?" "There's a section in the archives. Old reports from the 70s and 80s, back when there was that incident with the missing logging crew." Torres pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos. "I was doing research for a project last year and I came across these documents. Look." The image on Torres's phone showed a faded report from 1978. A logging operation near the Solduke River had lost an entire crew. 7 men who'd gone into a section of old-growth forest and never returned. The search had lasted 3 weeks. They'd found the equipment but no bodies. And everywhere in that section of forest, carved into virtually every tree, were the same symbols now appearing in Harper Williams's photos. "The investigation concluded equipment failure and animal predation," Torres said. "But one of the search and rescue people wrote an unofficial report, said the forest in that area felt wrong, said the trees were arranged in patterns that shouldn't be possible naturally, said they all heard something walking alongside them in the brush, pacing them, but whenever they tried to look directly at it, there was nothing there." Liam closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "Coincidence. People get disoriented in dense forests, their minds fill in gaps with patterns that aren't really there. It's basic psychology." "What about the symbols, though? Harper couldn't have known about the logging crew incident. It's not in any public records. She could have seen historical graffiti, old trail markers, or she carved them herself during a psychotic break." Even as Liam spoke, he was calculating distances and timelines in his head. The logging incident had occurred nearly 40 miles from Harper's last known position. There was no reasonable way she could have traveled that far off trail in her condition. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. He lay in his small apartment above the ranger station, listening to the rain hammer the roof, and thought about Harper Williams' voice on that video. The certainty in her tone when she said it was talking to her. The way she'd said, "The forest remembers," as if she were quoting something, reciting words that had been spoken to her. He'd heard plenty of people describe auditory hallucinations during exposure cases. They always sounded confused, uncertain, questioning what they heard. Harper had sounded like someone receiving a message, clear and direct. At 3 a.m., Liam gave up on sleep and went down to the office. He pulled the archival files Torres had mentioned, spreading them across his desk. The logging crew incident had been thoroughly documented, at least initially. Teams had combed through the area for weeks. They'd found the crew's equipment arranged in a careful circle around a particularly ancient Sitka spruce, each item placed precisely as if positioned for a ritual. The chainsaws had been disassembled, their parts scattered in patterns that matched the symbols carved into surrounding trees. One search and rescue report, written by a man named Douglas Garrett, contained a passage that made Liam's coffee go cold in his cup. Day 12 of search. Team penetrated to the logging crew's last known location. The forest here is different. Can't explain how. Trees are the same species, same age. But they're positioned in ways that shouldn't occur naturally. Perfect geometric patterns that create corridors leading away from the work site. Followed one such corridor for approximately 3 miles before team leader called us back. The further we walked, the more disoriented we became. Compasses spun freely, unable to find magnetic north. Radio communication became garbled, filled with what sounded like voices speaking in an unknown language. One team member, Jackson, claimed to see a figure moving through the trees parallel to our path. Described it as too tall to be human, walking on legs that bent wrong. We observed scratching sounds from all directions, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something were carving into wood. When we returned to base camp, we discovered that despite hiking for what felt like 3 hours, our GPS showed we'd moved less than 200 yards from our starting position. Request permission to suspend search in this sector. The men are increasingly unwilling to enter this area. The search had been suspended 2 days later. The official report cited adverse weather conditions and low probability of survivor recovery. Liam found himself Googling things he'd never thought to research before. Forest spirits, Slavic mythology, Leshy, a guardian of the woods, capable of shapeshifting, of leading travelers astray, of creating illusions so complete that victims would walk in circles until they died of exposure, sometimes mere yards from safety. According to the legends, a Leshy could make itself as tall as the trees or as small as a blade of grass. It protected sacred forests, punishing those who showed disrespect to nature. But that was Eastern European folklore. This was Washington State. Except, Liam clicked through more links, finding academic papers about cultural transmission of folklore, about how immigrant communities brought their beliefs to new lands, and found those beliefs merging with indigenous traditions. The Pacific Northwest tribes had their own forest guardians, spirits that inhabited ancient groves and demanded respect from those who entered. There were stories of entire hunting parties vanishing after violating taboos, of people who returned from the forest changed, speaking of impossible things they'd witnessed. He was chasing shadows, Liam told himself, letting Torres's superstition and a creepy video infect his rationality. Harper Williams was out there, probably hypothermic, definitely disoriented, possibly injured. What she needed was a professional search and rescue operation, not an investigator who'd started Googling forest spirits. But at dawn, when he assembled the search team, Liam found himself adding an unusual instruction. If anyone sees symbols carved into trees, geometric patterns, spirals, anything that looks deliberate, I want photos and GPS coordinates. Don't touch them, don't alter them, just document and report. The team leader, a veteran SAR coordinator named Chen, gave him a curious look but nodded. They found the first set of symbols within 2 hours. Liam hiked out to the location personally, Torres following quietly behind. The marks covered a dozen trees in a small clearing, all positioned at exactly the same height, 7 feet. The carvings looked fresh, bark still weeping sap, yet weathered at the same time, moss already establishing itself in the grooves. Impossible, sir, Torres said softly. Do you smell that? Liam did. The same sweet putrid scent from Harper's camera, but stronger here. Decomposition, but not quite. Like green wood burning, mixed with something mineral and old. Animal den nearby, probably, Liam said, but he was already pulling out his own camera, photographing the symbols from multiple angles. They formed a pattern, he realized. Not random graffiti, but a deliberate sequence, each mark flowing into the next. It looked almost like a sentence, though in what alphabet or language he couldn't begin to guess. Chen's voice crackled over the radio. Cooper, you need to see this. Grid section 7. They found the search coordinator standing at the edge of a trail that Liam had hiked dozens of times. Except the trail looked different now. The trees on either side leaned inward, branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel. The effect was so pronounced that Liam checked his map 3 times to confirm they were in the right location. This wasn't like this yesterday, Chen said flatly. My team covered this section. I personally walked this exact trail. The trees were normal. Now look at it. Liam wanted to argue that memory was unreliable, that the changing light created different impressions, but he'd hiked this trail too just last week. He knew Chen was right. Could be storm damage, he offered weakly. The winds last night. Winds don't make trees grow together into arches, Chen interrupted. And winds definitely don't do this. She pointed to the ground. The trail itself had changed. What should have been a clear dirt path was now partially obscured by roots that seemed to have erupted overnight, creating a barrier that forced hikers to walk single file through a gap, barely 2 feet wide. And on those roots, carved into the wood with the same precision as the symbols on the trees, were more markings. Liam knelt down, examining the carvings. They were warm to the touch. No, not warm. They pulsed with heat, a rhythmic throb that matched his own heartbeat. He jerked his hand back. "We're pulling the teams," Chen said. "Something's wrong here. I've been doing SAR for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The forest is changing around us." "We can't abandon the search," Liam protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're not. We're regrouping, bringing in additional resources, maybe some forestry experts to explain what's happening with these trees. But I'm not keeping my people in an environment that's actively shifting. That's how searchers become victims." As Chen radioed the withdrawal order, Liam walked further down the transformed trail, unable to stop himself. The tunnel of trees extended beyond his line of sight, growing darker and more enclosed the further it went. He could hear something in the distance, a rhythmic sound, like wood striking wood, echoing through the forest. "Cooper, don't," Torres warned, but Liam was already walking forward, drawn by professional curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. The drumming grew louder. No, not drumming. It was the sound of something heavy moving through underbrush, branches snapping in a deliberate pattern. Getting closer. Liam stopped walking. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to turn around, to rejoin the search team, to get out of this tunnel of trees before what? The smell hit him then, so strong it made him gag. Rot and growth, death and life, all mixed together in a stench that seemed fundamentally wrong. And with the smell came a sound, breathing, deep and wet, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness of the tree tunnel. Something was there, something massive, its presence so palpable that Liam's lizard brain screamed danger even as his conscious mind tried to rationalize what he was hearing. Just an elk, probably. Or a bear. Something large but explainable. Then it spoke, not in English, not in any language Liam recognized. The words were wet and organic, consonants that clicked and vowels that moaned, a voice that sounded like it came from a throat made of wood and moss. But impossibly, horrifyingly, Liam understood it. "You seek the one who took without asking." Liam's legs refused to move. He stood frozen in the middle of the trail tunnel, staring into the darkness ahead where something tall, too tall, was standing just beyond his field of vision. "She carved her name into my eldest child. She took mushrooms from my soil without offering. She walked where no permission was given. I don't..." Liam's voice cracked. "I don't understand. Harper Williams is missing. I'm looking for Harper Williams. The forest remembers all violations. The forest keeps all debts. She is here. She is there. She is becoming part of what she desecrated." The thing moved, and Liam saw it properly for the first time. It stood at least 9 feet tall, but its height seemed to shift and flow, sometimes appearing merely human-sized, other times stretching up to brush the interlocked branches overhead. Its body was made of wood, not covered in wood, but actually composed of it, bark and branch and root twisted into a rough approximation of a human form. Where its eyes should be, 2 knots in the wood grain glowed with a pale green luminescence. Its hands were bundles of twigs that moved with disturbing articulation, currently holding what looked like a staff carved from a single piece of ancient cedar. The Leshy. The word came to Liam unbidden, pulled from his late-night research. Forest guardian, shapeshifter, punisher of those who violated sacred spaces. "This isn't real," Liam said, his scientific mind making a last desperate attempt at rationality. "Exposure. I'm experiencing the same hallucinations as Harper. Carbon monoxide from an unknown source, or maybe fungal spores. You explain away what you fear to understand." The thing that was not possible tilted its head, bark creaking. Like the ones who came with machines of cutting. Like all who enter without respect. You bring your science like a shield, but the old powers laugh at your measurements and explanations. It took a step closer, and Liam saw that it left no footprints. Instead, where it walked, mushrooms erupted from the soil, growing impossibly fast, spreading in circles that matched the patterns carved into the trees. "Where is she?" Liam heard himself ask. "Where is Harper Williams?" "Everywhere." The leshy gestured with its twig fingers toward the trees. She became lost, and so she was woven into that which she violated. "Look closely at my children, scientist. See what happens to those who take without asking." Liam looked at the nearest tree, and massive Sitka spruce that had to be 300 years old. Its bark seemed to ripple in his vision, patterns resolving into something that made his gorge rise. There, in the wood grain, partially obscured by moss but unmistakable once you saw it, the outline of a human face, mouth open in a silent scream, and another face, higher up, and another, twisted into the living wood, preserved and trapped and aware. He could see eyes in the bark, still moving, still seeing. "Oh, Jesus," Liam whispered, stumbling backward. "Oh, Jesus Christ. Your cross God has no power here." The leshy's voice held something that might have been amusement. "Only the old laws apply. The laws of root and branch, of offering and exchange, of respect and punishment." "Please," Liam said, hating himself for begging but unable to stop. "Please, she didn't know. She didn't understand." Ignorance does not erase violation. The tree still bears the scar. The mushrooms still remember their theft. The trail still holds the imprint of unauthorized feet. The creature took another step closer, and Liam could smell the forest rot emanating from it, could see smaller things moving in the gaps of its wooden body, beetles and millipedes and things that had no names. "But you I have watched for years, scientist. You who explains away the inexplicable. You who brings comfort with your false truths. What do you want?" The question came out as barely a whisper, a choice. The leshy raised one twig hand, and suddenly there were two trails before Liam where moments ago there had been only one. The left path led back toward the ranger station, toward safety and sanity and everything he'd built his career upon. The right path led deeper into the tree tunnel, toward darkness and that wet breathing sound, and those faces in the bark. "Walk away, return to your station, write your report. Harper Williams died of exposure, her body never recovered, another tragedy in the wilderness. Continue your life of comfortable rationality, or walk forward, find her, perhaps even save her if you can pay the price that she could not. But if you enter deeper into my domain, you enter under my laws, and those laws demand respect, demand offering, demand understanding that you are not the apex here, that your science is not the ultimate truth. Can you do that, scientist? Can you humble yourself before what you cannot measure?" Liam looked at both paths. The left was lit by normal forest light, trees normal distances apart, moss and ferns growing in expected patterns. Rational, safe. Everything he'd believed in for 38 years. The right was madness, trees that moved, spirits that walked, reality that bent and twisted according to rules older than human comprehension. He thought of Harper Williams' mother, calling twice a day, voice breaking with each hour. He thought of those faces in the bark, aware and trapped and suffering. He thought of his career, his reputation, his sanity. He thought of Torres finding his camera, weeks from now, with photos that couldn't be explained and a final video of him saying impossible things about the forest remembering. Liam stepped onto the right path. The change was immediate and absolute. The moment his foot touched the trail, the world lurched sideways. The trees weren't just leaning inward anymore. They were moving, branches reaching out to guide him deeper into the tunnel. The ground beneath his feet pulsed like a living thing, roots shifting to create a path that led ever downward, though no slope had existed moments before. Behind him, he heard Chen's voice on his radio, tinny and faint. "Cooper, respond. Cooper, what's your position?" Then static, then silence. "Good," the leshy said, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere, emanating from the trees themselves. "You have chosen understanding over ignorance, but understanding comes with a price. Every step deeper requires an offering, Every truth revealed demands something in return. What kind of offering? Liam asked, though he suspected he didn't want the answer. The first offering is easy. Your certainty. Leave it at the threshold. Liam felt something pulling at his mind, extracting not a memory but a foundational belief. The comfortable certainty that had driven his career, the absolute faith that everything had a rational explanation, that science could quantify all phenomena, that the material world was all that existed. It was being ripped away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He wanted to resist, to cling to his rationality, but he found he couldn't, not while standing in a tunnel of trees that were demonstrably alive and aware, not while walking deeper into a forest that bent the laws of physics, not while negotiating with a creature from Eastern European folklore in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. His certainty crumbled, and with it went the last of his skepticism. The path opened up into a clearing that couldn't exist. Dozens of trees formed a perfect circle, their branches interwoven overhead to create a cathedral ceiling of living wood. And in the center of the clearing, surrounded by those geometric symbols carved into the earth itself, was Harper Williams. She was alive. Barely. Harper sat with her back against the central tree, a spruce so massive and ancient it made the other giants seem like saplings. Her arms and legs were partially merged with the bark, roots growing up from the soil to wrap around her limbs like living restraints. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and when she saw Liam, no recognition flickered in them. "Harper!" Liam ran forward, but stopped when the Leshy materialized directly in front of him, blocking his path. "She lives because I allow it," the spirit said. "She feeds the tree because she took from the forest. A fair exchange by the old laws." "This isn't fair, this is..." Liam struggled for words. "This is evil." Evil is a human word. The forest knows only balance. She took without asking. She carved without permission. She walked without respect. Now she gives back what she stole, and more besides. Her nutrients feed the tree. Her breath enriches the air. Her heat warms the soil. In time, she will be fully integrated, another face in the bark, another set of eyes that watch over this place. Liam looked at Harper more closely and saw the truth of it. Her skin had taken on a bark-like texture in places, and small mushrooms grew from her hair, from her shoulders. The transformation was slow but inevitable. "You said I could save her," Liam said. "You said if I paid the price..." "If you can pay the price," the Leshy corrected. "The question is whether you will." "What price?" The spirit gestured to the trees around the clearing, and Liam saw them now. More faces in the bark, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All the people who'd gone missing over the years. All the loggers and hikers and hunters who'd violated the sacred spaces without knowing, or worse, without caring. An exchange, the Leshy said simply. A life for a life. You take her place, feed the tree with your substance, and she goes free. That is the law of equivalent exchange. That is the only price I will accept. Liam's scientific mind, what remained of it, calculated odds and outcomes. If he refused, Harper died slowly over weeks, maybe months, as she was absorbed into the tree. If he agreed, he died the same way, but Harper lived. But there was a third option, wasn't there? Always was in these situations. He could fight. He could try to free Harper by force, drag her away from this clearing, get her back to civilization and medical treatment. As if reading his thoughts, the Leshy laughed, a sound like wind through dead branches. "You think you can take from me by force? You who could not even take your certainty without my permission? Try if you wish. It will cost you everything and save nothing. The roots are already through her lungs, scientist. If you pull her away, she drowns in her own blood within minutes." "There has to be another way," Liam said desperately. "Some other offering, some other price. There is no negotiation with nature. There is only acceptance or rejection. Choose." Liam looked at Harper Williams, at her glassy eyes and bark-textured skin, and the small mushrooms blooming from her flesh. He thought about her mother's voice on the phone, breaking with each call. He thought about the faces in the bark all around them, aware and trapped forever. He thought about his career, his reputation, his apartment above the ranger station, his certainty, already taken, his life, carefully constructed over 38 years. All of it weighed against one terrified hiker who'd taken some mushrooms and carved her name into a tree. The rational calculation was simple. He should refuse. One life saved wasn't worth one life lost. From a utilitarian standpoint, it was a zero-sum exchange. But Liam wasn't rational anymore. That offering had already been taken. "Do it," he heard himself say. "Take me instead. You accept the exchange freely?" "Yes. You understand there is no reversal, no rescue. You will become part of this forest until the tree itself dies, which may be centuries hence." "I understand." "Then approach the tree, scientist who was, and know that your sacrifice is recognized, your respect is acknowledged, your offering is accepted." Liam walked forward slowly, each step feeling like a mile. As he approached the central tree, he felt roots stirring beneath his feet, felt the bark becoming warm and almost welcoming. Harper's eyes focused suddenly, awareness returning to them, and she tried to speak, but only a small moan emerged. "It's okay," Liam told her softly. "Someone's got to explain this one rationally, right? Might as well be me." He placed his hands on the tree bark, and the roots surged upward with shocking speed. They wrapped around his ankles, his calves, growing into his flesh with surprising gentleness. The pain was intense but distant, as if happening to someone else's body. As the roots climbed higher, binding him to the ancient spruce, Liam felt the roots releasing Harper. The bark peeled away from her skin. The mushrooms fell from her hair. The tree that had been absorbing her turned its attention fully to him instead. Harper collapsed forward, gasping, her throat working as she tried to scream or speak or simply breathe. The Leshy walked to her, its wooden form towering over her prone body. "Go," it said simply. "Walk the path that opens for you. Return to your people. Tell them nothing or tell them everything. They will believe or they will not. But remember this. The forest watches. The forest remembers. And now, the forest has its keeper." A trail appeared in the circle of trees, glowing faintly with foxfire, leading away from the clearing. Harper crawled toward it at first, then managed to stand on shaking legs. She looked back at Liam once, her eyes full of comprehension and horror and terrible gratitude. Then she ran. Liam watched her disappear down the trail, and then the roots reached his chest, growing through his ribs with a sensation like being slowly filled with cold water. He could feel the tree now, its vast consciousness awakening to his presence, welcoming him into its wood and fiber. He could feel the other faces in the bark, all the people who'd come before, all the people who'd made the same mistake Harper had, who hadn't had anyone to take their place. They spoke to him without words, shared their awareness. The long, slow time of trees where years passed like days, where seasons turned like the wheels of some vast clock. He would feel every ring of growth, every drop of rain, every bird that nested in the branches overhead. He would be aware and conscious and trapped for centuries, or until the tree finally died. The Leshy's face appeared before him, made of bark and moss, eyes of glowing wood. "Your science sought to explain me away," it said, "but in the end you chose belief over rationality. You chose sacrifice over survival. That is the oldest magic, scientist. That is the power your measurements cannot capture." "I didn't do it for magic," Liam managed to say as the roots reached his throat. "I did it because it was right. Yes, that too is balance. That too is law." The roots covered Liam's mouth, his nose, growing into his lungs with a rush that felt like drowning and breathing at the same time. His vision blurred, then cleared, but it was different now. He saw from every angle at once, from every face in every tree in the clearing. He saw Harper stumbling out of the forest hours later, falling into Chen's arms, unable to speak, unable to explain. He saw the search teams combing the area for his body, never finding it. He saw Torres standing in the clearing, staring directly at the central tree, at the new face that had appeared in the bark. Torres's lips moved, saying, "I'm sorry," before he turned away. Seasons passed. Winter came, snow covering the clearing, ice forming on branches. Spring returned, bringing rain and new growth. Summer blazed hot. Autumn painted the deciduous trees gold. And through it all, Liam remained, aware and watching, a permanent fixture in the forest he'd spent 14 years believing he understood. He had explained away 23 disappearances. Now he was number 24, and on quiet nights when the wind moved through the branches just right, hikers on the nearby trails would sometimes report hearing a voice in the forest. Not words exactly, but a sound like a warning, like a caution, like someone trying desperately to tell them, turn back, show respect, make offerings. The forest remembers everything, but they never listened. They never did. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? William Chen had always prided himself on being the kind of ranger who could explain everything. 15 years in Olympic National Park had taught him that mysterious disappearances usually involved poor planning, twisted ankles, and embarrassed hikers who'd wandered off trail. Strange sounds in the forest were always owls, or elk, or wind through the ancient cedars. Unexplained phenomena had explanations. You just had to look hard enough. That certainty died on October 23, 2009, when Emily Volkov stopped responding to her radio. The morning had started unremarkably. William had been processing permits at the Ho Rainforest Station when Emily checked in at 6:47 a.m., her voice crackling through the static. Heading up the Bogachil Trail to check those erosion markers. Weather's perfect. Should be back by 1400. Copy that, William had replied, already thinking about the paperwork waiting on his desk. Stay safe out there, Em. Those were the last words he'd say to her. By 3:30 p.m., when Emily's truck still sat alone in the trailhead parking lot, William felt the first whisper of unease. Emily was never late. She was meticulous, almost obsessive about protocols, a trait she'd inherited from her grandfather, who'd emigrated from somewhere in Russia she never talked about much. William had always assumed it was Soviet trauma, the way she'd change the subject whenever he asked. He tried her radio, static. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail, which meant nothing up there. Coverage was non-existent past mile marker 3. Still, procedure was procedure. William logged the situation, grabbed his emergency pack, and headed up the Bogachil Trail as the afternoon light turned honey gold through the canopy. The Olympic temperate rainforest was one of the most primordial places left in the lower 48 states. Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose like cathedral pillars, some over 300 feet tall, their trunks wider than William's Ranger truck. Moss draped everything in shades of emerald and jade, and the air itself felt thick, weighted with moisture and the smell of decomposition. That sweet, rich rot of centuries of fallen timber returning to earth. William had walked these trails 1,000 times. He knew every switchback, every landmark. But as he moved deeper into the forest, something felt different. Wrong. The light, maybe. It seemed to come from odd angles, filtering through the canopy in ways that made distances hard to judge. Or the silence, too complete, too sudden. The usual soundscape of chittering squirrels and distant woodpeckers had vanished, replaced by a cottony quiet that made his own breathing sound obscenely loud. At mile marker 4, he found Emily's day pack. It sat in the middle of the trail, carefully placed, not dropped. William's pulse kicked up as he knelt beside it. No signs of struggle, no torn fabric or scattered contents. The pack was simply there, zipped closed, as if Emily had set it down intending to return. Inside, her water bottle half full, granola bars, first aid kit, GPS unit still powered on. William activated the GPS and felt his stomach clench. According to the device, Emily had been moving in circles for hours. The track log showed a bizarre spiral pattern centered about a quarter mile northeast of the trail, deep in old growth where no marked paths existed. The loops grew tighter and tighter until they ended abruptly at 11:33 a.m., Over 4 hours ago. That's impossible, William muttered, studying the screen. Emily knew these woods. She wouldn't get lost, and she certainly wouldn't walk in circles for hours without realizing it. He keyed his radio. Base, this is Ranger Chen. I've located Emily's equipment at mile marker 4 Bogachil Trail. GPS data is anomalous. I'm proceeding northeast to last known coordinates. The response was barely audible through waves of static. Copy, Chen. Weather, deteriorating. Return before. Then nothing. The radio died completely, not even static. William checked the battery, full charge. He smacked it against his palm. Dead. The rational part of his brain, the part that had guided him through a decade and a half of wilderness work, cataloged possible explanations. Solar flare interference, equipment malfunction, local magnetic anomaly. All unlikely, but not impossible. The other part of his brain, the ancient hindbrain that still remembered when humans were prey, whispered, "Run." William ignored it and pushed into the undergrowth. The forest changed as he left the trail. The trees grew closer together, their bark blackened with age, their roots twisting across the ground like arthritic fingers. Mushrooms erupted in strange formations, perfect circles of brown caps that looked almost deliberate. Fairy rings, people called them. William had always dismissed the folklore. 15 minutes in, he found the first carving. It was cut deep into the bark of a massive cedar, about 8 feet off the ground. Not recent, the wood had aged, darkened, but the symbol was unmistakable. Cyrillic letters forming words William couldn't read, surrounding a crude figure that might have been human or might have been tree. Branching limbs extended from its head like antlers, or roots, or both. William took a photo with his digital camera, though he had no idea what it meant. Emily had mentioned her family was Russian Orthodox. Maybe some kind of religious marker, but why here in the middle of nowhere? He found 3 more carvings as he navigated toward Emily's last GPS position. Each one similar, each one old, decades old by the look of the weathered wood. The symbols were accompanied by offerings that had long since rotted away. Metal cups rusted to lace, fragments of cloth bleached colorless by time, animal bones arranged in patterns William's rational mind refused to interpret as intentional. The light was failing when he heard her voice. "William?" His head snapped up. "Emily, Emily, where are you? William, help me. I'm lost." The voice came from ahead, thin and distant. William crashed through the undergrowth, relief flooding through him. "Keep talking, I'm coming." "William, I can't find the trail. Everything looks the same." He ran toward the sound, branches whipping his face. The forest seemed to press in around him, the trees leaning at angles that made his inner ear scream. He stumbled over roots that seemed to shift underfoot. "Emily, keep talking." "William." The voice was right ahead now, just beyond a massive deadfall. "William, I'm so cold." He scrambled over the fallen log and stopped. Nothing. No one. Just more trees, more moss, more mushroom circles growing in impossible perfection. "Emily?" His voice cracked. Behind him, impossibly behind him now, though he'd just heard it ahead, came her voice again. "William, why did you leave me?" He spun. Empty forest. "This isn't funny, Em." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, tinged with fear he didn't want to acknowledge. "If you can hear me, stay put, I'll find you." Laughter drifted through the trees. Not Emily's laugh. Something else. Something that made his skin crawl, that hit frequencies human vocal cords shouldn't produce. William fumbled for his compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. He checked his GPS. No signal. His radio remained dead. The sun was setting, and he suddenly had no idea which direction was out. "Okay," he said aloud, forcing his voice steady. "Okay, think logically. The moss grows on the north side of trees. The drainage patterns run west toward the coast. I don't need instruments. I can navigate by natural signs." But when he looked, the moss grew everywhere, coating all sides of the trunks equally. The ground seemed perfectly level, revealing no drainage slope. Even the fading light came from all directions at once, diffuse and directionless. I'm walking in circles, he realized. Just like Emily. The thought unlocked something cold in his chest. William had studied search and rescue cases where experienced hikers got disoriented, where some cognitive glitch made them unable to walk straight, but he'd never experienced it himself. He knew these woods. He knew. William. Emily's voice again, but different now. Flatter, like a recording played back. William, come find me. I'm at the old place, where the roots grow deep. What old place? He shouted. Emily, I don't understand. Come to the circle, William. Come to the circle. And then he saw them. The trees ahead formed a perfect clearing, maybe 50 feet across, but it wasn't natural. William could see where smaller trees had been uprooted, their root balls torn from the earth and dragged away. In the center of the clearing stood 7 ancient cedars, arranged in a heptagon, their trunks carved with the same Cyrillic symbols he'd seen earlier. Between the trees, offerings, recent ones. William approached slowly, his hand dropping to the bear spray on his belt, useless against whatever this was, but the weight was comforting. As he got closer, he could make out details that made his throat tight. Cups of milk curdled and rank, bread, moldy and picked over by insects, strips of cloth tied to branches, fluttering in a breeze William couldn't feel, and at the base of the largest cedar, a photograph. He knelt and picked it up with shaking hands. The photo showed a group of people, maybe 20, standing in this exact clearing. The image was old. The colors faded to sepia tones, the clothing dating it to perhaps the 1920s or 30s. The faces were serious, grim even, and every person held something. A cup, a loaf, a blade. In the background, barely visible, something stood among the trees, something tall. William's rational mind tried to explain it as a trick of light and shadow, but the shape was too deliberate, too anatomically wrong. A figure that towered above the trees, impossibly elongated with limbs that branched like wood, and a face, if it was a face, obscured by what might have been beard or moss or hanging roots. No, William said firmly. No, it's a tradition, some immigrant community practicing old customs, folk religion. There's nothing supernatural here. Are you certain? William's heart stopped. The voice came from directly behind him, Emily's voice, but wrong, layered with harmonics that didn't belong. He turned slowly. Emily stood at the edge of the clearing, but not Emily. The proportions were subtly off, too tall, limbs too long, joints bending at angles that made his eyes water. The face was Emily's, but the expression was empty, a mask worn by something that didn't understand human emotion. Em? The word barely made it past his lips. She walked in circles, not Emily said. And now William could hear other voices beneath hers. Male voices, old voices, speaking words in Russian or some language even older. Round and round until the forest took her, as it takes all who trespass. Where is she? William's hand tightened on his beer spray canister. What did you do with her? The thing wearing Emily's shape tilted its head at an impossible angle. I showed her the old paths, the spiral way, the endless circle. She understands now. She is quiet in the roots. It stepped forward, and William saw the truth of it. Not a person wearing Emily's form, but something else. Something that had studied Emily and built an approximation from wood and moss and stolen skin. Where it moved, bark cracked. Where it stepped, mushrooms erupted in perfect rings. The grandmother people tried to appease me, it said, gesturing to the carved trees. They brought me gifts. They respected the old boundaries. But you new people, you walk anywhere, you mark nothing, you forget. I don't... William's voice shook. I don't know what you're talking about. This is a national park, protected land. Protected? The thing laughed, and Emily's voice shattered into 1,000 wooden creaking sounds. This was mine when your kind lived in caves. Mine when the great ice covered the earth. Mine when the first tree pushed up from stone. It grew as it spoke. Or William shrank. Or the proportions of the clearing changed, reality bending like light through water. The thing that had been Emily-shaped now towered, its head brushing the canopy, its limbs extending into branches that seemed to merge with the surrounding cedars. "I am Leshak," it said, and the voice was wind through leaves, was roots splitting stone, was the slow creak of growing wood. "I am the forest lord, and you have violated my domain." William's rational mind, his scientific training, his 15 years of explaining away mysteries, all of it crumbled like rotten wood. This wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything his training had prepared him for. "Please," he heard himself say. "Please, I just want to find my friend." "Your friend feeds the mycelium now," Leshak said. "Her bones are wrapped in roots. She walked the spiral path until she forgot which way was out, and then she simply stopped. As you will stop, little ranger." The trees around the clearing began to move, their roots sliding across the ground like serpents, closing off any escape. William backed toward the center, his mind screaming at him to run while his body understood the futility. "Wait!" he fumbled in his pack. "The offerings. The old people left offerings. I have." He pulled out his canteen, a granola bar, his ranger badge. Pathetic compared to the ceremony in the photograph, but maybe. Leshak's laughter was the sound of branches breaking in a storm. "You bring me tin and processed wheat? You wear a badge that claims dominion over what you do not own?" The creature leaned down, and William saw its face wasn't a face at all, just shadows and hollow spaces where a face should be. Darkness that went down and down into depths that couldn't exist in a skull-sized space. The grandmother people understood balance. They knew the old laws. You understand nothing. William's legs buckled. He fell to his knees in the center of the circle, surrounded by trees that were closing in, confronted by a thing that shouldn't exist, but absolutely, terrifyingly did. "I believe," he whispered. "I believe now, please. I believe." "Belief changes nothing," Leshak said. "The forest takes what it will take." And William knew, with horrible certainty, that he was going to die here. That his bones would join Emily's in the soil. That search parties would find his truck and his equipment and nothing else. That he would become another unexplained disappearance that some other rational ranger would try to explain away. His hand touched something in the leaf litter. Without thinking, he grabbed it, a fragment of the old offerings, a small metal cup, tarnished and ancient. Cyrillic letters were etched around its rim. Kozain. William read haltingly, sounding out the unfamiliar letters. Leshi. Prosty. The forest went absolutely still. "You speak the old tongue?" Leshak's voice had changed, become less wind-like, more curious. I can't." William looked at the cup, at the words. "Forgive? Is that... Are you asking for forgiveness?" "They asked for mine," the creature said softly. "The grandmother people. When they cut wood, when they gathered food, when they walked my paths, they asked permission. They showed respect." William's mind raced. The Russian immigrants. Emily's grandfather's people. They'd come from places where these traditions still held power, where the forest was still alive with old gods and older spirits. They'd known. They'd tried to maintain the balance. "I didn't know," William said, and meant it. "We didn't know. We thought we were protecting the forest. We thought designation as a park, keeping it preserved." "You thought you could own it," Leshak interrupted. "You thought your paper and your laws gave you dominion. But the forest owns itself. I own myself, and I do not forgive easily." The roots had reached William now, wrapping around his ankles, beginning to pull him down into soil that had gone soft, almost liquid. He could feel it sucking at him, hungry. "Then don't forgive," William gasped. "But let me make it right. Let me warn the others. Let me teach them what you've taught me." Let me restore the offerings, the respect, the... Why should I trust you? Leshak leaned closer, and William could smell it now. Petrichor and decay, mushroom spores and sap. Your kind makes promises and breaks them. You say you will preserve, and then you carve trails and build structures and flood my domain with those who do not understand. Because I'm terrified, William said honestly. Because I know now that I know nothing. Because I'll never be able to explain this, and that will haunt me forever. The silence stretched. The roots paused in their constriction. You are broken now, Leshak observed. Your certainty is shattered. You will never walk these woods without fear again. Yes, William agreed. Your friend is gone, lost to the spiral. Her grandfather knew the old ways, taught her the prayers, but she forgot. She walked my paths without respect, without acknowledgement, and the forest claimed its due. Tears ran down William's face. I know. If I release you, you will carry this burden. The knowledge that you cannot explain. The truth that no one will believe. You will seem mad, perhaps become mad, and you will know that your friend died because of ignorance. Yours, hers, your society's. I know, William repeated. Leshak studied him with eyes that weren't eyes, considering. Then slowly, the creature began to shrink, to fold in on itself, to become less impossible and more merely wrong. The roots retreated. The trees stopped moving. Go, Leshak said, and now it sounded almost human, almost weary. Walk the spiral backward. When you see the mushroom rings, step only in their centers. When you hear voices, do not answer. And when you return to your people, tell them. The creature paused. Tell them the forest remembers. Tell them the old pacts are not void. And tell them that the next who trespasses without respect will not be given a choice. William nodded numbly. And Emily? She feeds the roots now. In spring, white flowers will bloom where she rests. Trillium ovatum, I believe you call them. Your friend loved those flowers. It was true. Emily had always stopped to photograph the trilliums every spring. Can I see where... No. The word was final. You may remember her, but you may not disturb her rest. She is part of the forest now, forever. William wanted to argue, to demand, to rage against the unfairness, but he had no leverage here, no authority. He was a trespasser being shown mercy he hadn't earned and probably didn't deserve. Thank you, he whispered. Leshak didn't respond. It simply faded, becoming shadow, becoming texture, becoming part of the trees until William couldn't tell where the creature ended and the forest began. He was alone in the clearing with the ancient cedars and their carved warnings. William looked at the cup in his hands, the one that had saved him, and carefully placed it back among the offerings. Then he walked to the edge of the clearing, found the mushroom ring, and stepped into its center. The world lurched. He was 100 yards away near another ring. He stepped into it and lurched again. The forest was helping him now, or Leshak was, or maybe there was no difference. Each time he found a circle of mushrooms and stepped inside, he jumped further, the spiral unwinding, spitting him back toward the human world. When he finally stumbled onto the main trail, the sun was rising. A full night had passed in what felt like an hour. His radio crackled to life with frantic voices calling his name. His GPS showed his position clearly, accurately, rationally. But William knew he'd never be rational again. They searched for Emily for 3 weeks. William guided the teams, but he knew they'd find nothing. He watched the K9 units run in circles. He watched the helicopters fly grid patterns over forest that refused to give up its secrets. He watched Emily's parents weep and her grandfather, old, bent, speaking more Russian than English in his grief, light candles and pray. On the last day of the official search, William found the old man alone near the trailhead, kneeling before a small shrine he'd constructed. Orthodox icons, a cup of milk, a loaf of bread. Leshy, the grandfather whispered, and his eyes met William's. There was knowing in that gaze and terrible, tired understanding. My father told me the stories. I thought they stayed behind in the old country. But the forest is the forest, yes? Wherever there are old trees, there are old gods. William knelt beside him. I'm sorry, I didn't know. She forgot, the old man said. I should have taught her better. Should have made her understand. But this is America, yes? We try to forget the old ways. We try to become modern. He looked at William with ancient eyes. But the forest remembers. Always remembers. They sat together in silence as the sun set through the cedars. William kept working as a ranger. He had no choice. He had no other skills. And besides, someone had to know. Someone had to watch. He began learning Russian from a tutor in Port Angeles, started researching Slavic folklore, reading everything he could find about forest spirits and old pacts and the traditions his rational mind had once dismissed as superstition. He found the records of the Russian Orthodox community that had settled near Olympic National Forest in the 1910s and 20s, found documentation of their logging practices, their seasonal celebrations, their careful rituals before entering the deep woods, found photographs of ceremonies at the Seven Cedars, of offerings left at carefully marked boundaries. The community had died out by the 1950s, dispersed, assimilated, and their children had forgotten. The Park Service had purchased the land, preserved it, protected it, but without understanding what that protection required, William tried to explain to his superiors, tried to suggest that perhaps some areas should be truly off-limits, that perhaps the old logging boundaries marked something important, that perhaps traditional ecological knowledge from immigrant communities should be respected. They smiled and nodded and assigned him to a desk job when his stress became too obvious. But William still hiked the trails every week. Still left offerings at the Seven Cedars, nothing official, just personal acts, milk and bread and respectful silence. He warned hikers about staying on trail, about not disturbing old markers, about respecting the forest. Most thought he was eccentric. Some thought he was crazy. And every spring, he returned to the clearing, walking the spiral path carefully, stepping only in mushroom circles, and found the white trilliums blooming in a perfect circle where no trilliums had grown before. He sat with them for hours, talking to Emily, apologizing, remembering. Once, just once, he heard her voice on the wind. It's okay, Will, I understand now, I'm home. He wanted to believe it was real. He wanted to believe it was just his grief. He had no idea which would be worse. At night, when he closed his eyes, William saw the Leshak in the space between sleep and waking, that impossible figure towering over the trees, those hollow spaces where eyes should be, that presence that was forest and God, and something older than either. His certainty never returned. His ability to explain the world rationally had shattered like rotten wood, and the pieces wouldn't fit back together. He knew too much now. He believed too deeply. And he understood, finally, what Emily's grandfather had tried to teach his family. The forest wasn't something you preserved or managed or owned. It was something you negotiated with, something you respected, something that remembered. William Chen had spent 15 years explaining away mysteries. Now he spent his days knowing that some mysteries were never meant to be explained, only survived. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?